Welcome to the 50th episode of the New Ventures podcast. I'm your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. I host the New Ventures podcast to help people starting climate initiatives learn from others who are already progressed in their paths. Today is a special episode, being the 50th, and we will talk about how partnerships can accelerate climate adaptation. Our guests are Dr. Irene Amoke, the CEO of Kenya Wildlife Trust, and James Alden, the founder of Climate Edge. The Kenya Wildlife Trust works in the area of healthy ecosystems and predator conservation in the Greater Mara region of Kenya. Climate Edge is a UK company which develops digital tools for smallholder farmers. Welcome, Irene. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Sanjoy. It's good to be here.
Thank you, Sanjoy. I look forward to our conversation.
Irene, we'll start with you. Please tell us a little bit about your work at the Kenya Wildlife Trust.
All right. Thank you, Sanjoy. So I run the Kenya Wildlife Trust, which is a Kenyan-based organization. We are a small trust working out of Nairobi, but with a really big footprint in the Mara where we do a lot of our projects. So Kenya Wildlife Trust's greatest objective is predator conservation. And we do this by using research to understand the numbers of predators, the threats facing these predators, then work hand in hand with communities to develop and implement conservation strategies that would help protect these predators further. And KWT really believes in using science and evidence-based to drive our solutions. And we find that people are always at the center of the work we do. And again, we strongly believe in partnerships, working with like-minded organizations and companies to help us drive this conservation agenda, which is how we got ourselves working with Climate Edge.
And James, you could tell us a little bit about the tools that you have developed at Climate Edge.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Climate Edge, we are a software development company. We're also a social enterprise, so we are working towards generating an impact. And what we're building is what we call a farmer relationship manager, which is quite like a customer relationship manager like HubSpot, Salesforce, but tailored towards smallholder farmers in emerging markets. And we're building these tools to try and create a more sustainable and fair future for global agriculture. Some of your audience, if they're interested in, climate in Africa, will probably also know the importance of smallholder agriculture. So approximately around $700 billion worth of goods and services are bought and sold from smallholder farmers. But the majority of those farmers are in remote locations and disconnected from things like, the internet. And so most businesses are forced to interact with those farmers to get information about their products and services in a face-to-face manner through field agents. This is essentially really, really expensive, and it limits the quality of services that those farmers can receive. And that's the problem that we're trying to solve at Climate Edge. So our farmer relationship manager works in a very similar way to tools like HubSpot and Salesforce. So it essentially gives you a central database to organize your relationships with all of those farmers. But the difference is that our tool is very, very specialized for this market. So, for example, we've built our platform to be mobile first because we know, again, that most farmers don't have emails or don't usually access websites and things like that. So our platform is driven through interactions via SMS or automated phone calls. And the database that powers our platform is very specialized to the specific types of information that relates to agriculture. And that's really what gives us that kind of ability to work effectively in this market.
So obviously this will be a fascinating discussion because I'm sure people are already wondering, what does a predator conservation trust have to do with smallholder farmers? And that too in Kenya, and then they're developed out of UK. To set the context, let's start by trying to transport our audience to the Greater Mara region. And maybe, Irene, you could help us do that.
Yes, Sanjoy. So the Mara region is in the southeastern part of the country, and the Masai Mara is one of Kenya's crown jewels. We always talk about, coming on safari, and the Mara really talks to people when you're thinking of wildlife and, seeing people living close and coexisting with wildlife. And so the Mara is probably best known for the annual wildebeest migration across the Mara and Serengeti. But within that ecosystem, we have the largest viable population of lions in the country, over 400 lions. We've got cheetahs, huge numbers of herbivores, close to 500 birds. So it's an international bird area, recognized. But then what makes the Mara so special is the people who stay in that ecosystem and how they've lived for centuries with the wildlife that, stay in that landscape. And so what the Kenya Wildlife Trust does there is work on wildlife conservation, but being very cognizant of the people who are living there. And we aim to work really closely with them, learn from them, and just try to, make sure that this landscape stays. We can't say that it's going to stay pristine, but that it keeps on being what people think of the wildlife and people together. So that's transporting you to the Mara. So lots of animals and people, but that's not to say that there are no problems there, which is obviously one of the big things we're going to talk about on this podcast today.
And just to add to that from my side, I think it's really, really great introduction by Irene, and where we really focus is on those people. And I think something that a lot of people from my perspective, people who haven't visited Africa or don't know Kenya very well, often have a lot of misconceptions of what places like the Mara are really like. And so when we're talking about the farmers in the Mara, they're generally pastoralists. So people who look after livestock, so cows, goats and sheep. But they are still quite sophisticated in their farming practices, in the fact that they do use antibiotics in terms of caring for their livestock. They really know their animals in terms of their animal welfare in a lot of detail. And that's kind of where our kind of interest comes in here, is how can we support KWT in their own goals of keeping that balance between the wildlife and the people who live in the Mara. And we're trying to provide those tools that can help those farmers look after their livestock in a most sustainable and least impactful way. And that's kind of where our real interest is, in those people there.
Thank you, Irene and James. I think you've already touched a little bit about this. There are, behind the spectacular landscape of the Greater Mara region, the wildlife, there lies problems. So maybe we could start us by understanding what the problems are, and maybe even reflect a little bit about the causes of these problems. And which is, I think, your livelihoods project is trying to address, right? So if you could give us a little bit of insight into this.
Yes, Sanjay. So one of the biggest challenges facing wildlife, not just in the Mara, but across Kenya and a lot of Africa, is loss of space and lack of habitat. And climate change is a big thing as well. So as KWT, the work we do with the communities in mitigating human-wildlife conflict, as well as the science that drives some of that, those conservation projects, we have to look at the people who live with the wildlife. And it's all well and good for us to go and try and say, oh, don't worry when the lion kills your livestock, you need to coexist. First, we cannot claim to teach the local communities or the Masai how to coexist, because it is something that they've always done. So we can only seek to enhance it and address some of these challenges facing them. And so we found that we spent a lot of time dealing with human-wildlife conflict, especially around predators. So having lions and hyenas attacking livestock. And my team, we constantly have to go out to the community and try and, get people to understand that, that's what, wildlife does. And there is closer interaction than before, because the population has increased like everywhere else. Land use has changed. There's been land subdivision. So you've got people owning smaller pieces of land as opposed to communal living, which is how traditionally the Masai live. And during COVID, we then had, these conversations about looking at livelihoods, because tourism, which is the mainstay of the Mara, was really affected. And so talking to communities about their livelihoods. So how else could we complement what we are doing in terms of wildlife protection and conservation, whilst ensuring that the people who lived with the wildlife were actually gaining from conservation. And so this livelihoods program was one of the solutions we came up with, obviously working with partners and talking and engaging the communities on what are some of the issues that are limiting them from realizing best income and return from their livestock. So someone might ask, you do predator conservation, so why are you looking at livelihoods? And my answer is always that you cannot talk about wildlife conservation if you're not talking about households and livelihoods and bettering the lives of people who live with wildlife. So that was the genesis of, the project, and also trying to address some of the key challenges that face wildlife in the country and in the Mara.
James, how did your technology help in Irene's objective?
Yeah, so I think Irene explained it really well there, that what we're trying to support is supporting the farmer livelihoods in order to support those wider goals of helping kind of balance the wildlife and the community. When you then look at, well, what is impacting the livelihoods of the pastoral farmers in the Mara region, it's things like not being able to get information about pests and diseases that their cattle might have. Again, people who aren't necessarily familiar with agriculture may not be aware, but when a cow gets sick, for example, the symptoms can be quite vague, and often it's difficult to know specifically what the actual root cause of that disease might be. In the Mara region, from the research that we did, a lot of the farmers said that if they just see that their cattle get sick, their first response will be just to buy a generic antibiotic and give that to their cattle and hope that it gets better. But we know that a lot of the diseases aren't bacterial diseases, and actually an overuse of antibiotics leads to antibiotic resistance for when treating actual bacterial diseases. So things like this are actually, this lack of information to farmers and this lack of support is what leads to strains on livelihoods of farmers. There's also things like getting information about when a good time to sell cattle is, or buy cattle, or goats and sheep as well. And this is really the problem that we were trying to address. In terms of our technology, one part is the actual kind of technology solution itself, but then the other part is us coming in as a partner to Kenya Wildlife Trust and being able to actually support in the kind of the ideation of what that solution needs to look like as experts in software development. So again, with these kind of populations, they're not used to using technology like we are I am, for example, in the UK, using technology all the time. There are very few technological solutions that are actually been built for these kind of populations. So a big thing that we do is actually come in, and this really aligns with KWT's science and evidence-based approach. We came in and did some research to actually figure out how our product could be configured in the best way to suit that local population. So one thing that we did, for example, one of my colleagues, Cami, went to the Mara and did some research with the farmers, because our idea was that initially we would create a decision tree that would be based on SMS, because SMS is very affordable, it's very accessible. Those SMSs would allow farmers to essentially use a diagnostic decision tree saying, do you have this symptom, yes or no? That would allow them to get to a diagnosis of what the most likely thing their cattle or livestock has. But from our research, what we found was that actually for some of the older farmers, literacy was really low, both in English, Swahili, and in local languages as well in Mara. And so we quickly realized, for example, that actually a text-based solution would not be very effective because it would really miss out the benefit of that big population that weren't literate. So we knew that we would have to try and work out how we could use a voice-based solution where you have automated pre-recorded voice messages that could be sent in the same way to those farmers. So that's really where we come in, is just helping from a technological point of view, help KWT understand how a product can be configured to get the best result for them. And then the actual product itself allows us to deliver that technology as well. So we go from both the kind of the understanding, the research at the beginning, all the way through to actually building the solution that can then be rolled out to farmers. And that's how we come in, is to try and get better information at scale to those farmers. So there's less dependency on face-to-face physical relationships. I think one thing that's probably worth bearing in mind for the context of why our solution fits this project is that, again, from our research, we found that the vets would often be, so vets are people who had information about livestock diseases and the information about how to treat livestock, they would be based in the towns, but many of the farmers would be, up to a 5-hour walk away from that town. So they don't have good access to that sort of information very regularly, because taking an entire day or 2 days out of your schedule when you've got a lot of things going on is not really that feasible. So that's why we have a big focus on digital interventions, which can allow information to be delivered at scale and in real time. And again, that's a really important part of where we can come in and support KWT. It doesn't remove the need for field agents, but it plays a different role that can support those field agents to get more information and more support to those farmers.
This is excellent to help us understand the technology and how it got applied, and also, Irene, the livelihoods project that you talked about. But I'm still struggling a little bit to join some of the dots. So one thing that I want to understand a little bit more is the impact of climate change. And anybody who reads anything about climate change knows that these areas of Kenya suffer from food security issues. Water could be scarce. There would be mortalities of cattle, for example. There would be heat stress on cattle. New types of pests and diseases could come up. Could you just help us understand the climate change impact and then link it with predator conservation issues?
Yes, I'd mentioned earlier, the Masai are predominantly pastoralists, but due to changes in land tenure legally in Kenya, there's a change in policy, you find that they've become more sedentary. And what that has meant is that culturally, the Masai keep a lot of livestock. So each family tends to have a lot of livestock, and with new breeds coming up, more disease-resistant breeds, especially of the smaller stock, so sheep and goats, these numbers have really, really increased in the Mara. And a couple of years ago, some research showed that sheep and goats had increased by up to 600% across the whole county, not just the Mara, but across, the whole county where the Mara sits. And what this means is that there's more stress on the grass in the area, and there's more stress on water. And this landscape is what wildlife uses. So there's more competition between the resources, between livestock and wildlife, leading to more conflict. And that's coupled with changes in weather, so longer dry periods, and sometimes when it rains, really heavy rains, floods. So a lot of the topsoil is washed away, the rivers burst their banks. And so just the effect of climate change and unpredictable weather cycles has just made these challenges on the landscape even more. And so that means that conflict cases are more pronounced. We get more reports of conflict because the areas that have grass then have high numbers of both livestock and wildlife, and that inevitably leads to conflict. And so with this livelihoods program, as much as we are looking to work with the communities on how to get better value for livestock by looking at better animal husbandry practices, as James has said, putting them in touch with vets, making sure diseases are diagnosed well and treated, and then there's access to market. We are also talking to them about the landscape. How can we then incorporate methods and, advances in trying to restore some of these degraded grazing areas, which is good for livestock, but it's also good for wildlife. And so there is also an element of restoration of the degraded landscapes, because overgrazing is a big consequence of large herds of livestock. And then you have wildlife as well, really eating the same grass. So those are some of, the more obvious impacts of climate change on the ecosystem. And that's one of the drivers of why we're looking at this livelihoods program, because it addresses a livelihoods need, but then it also addresses a biodiversity need in terms of making sure that we've got enough grass for both wildlife and livestock.
Okay, great. It's very interesting because this is helping me join the dots, and which is why, just to help our audience understand, this is why James uses the word farmers when we are talking about the Masai. Because Irene, what you're saying is that the Masai have undergone a lifestyle change, if you may, from pure pastoralists to farmers. And though earlier they owned large communal lands, they today own smaller plots of land, and the types of animals they rear have changed. The number of smaller animals like sheep has increased, and they graze in these communal lands, where the predators also graze. There's a competition for the grazing lands. There's also competition for water because the dry spells are becoming longer, and when it rains is becoming more intense. So that's what is causing this animal, shall I say, the Masai own animal, the predator animals conflict, which is sort of propagating itself into human animal conflict. That's the way I'm summarizing what you're saying. James, one of the things that I'm always curious to learn, and you have already started talking about it, is that you cannot airdrop technology in any location, right? So you discussed how your colleague went and worked with the farmers. My question was that what type of things, Irene, you had to do to help support the colleagues of James when they came to understand what the user base needs?
All right. So part of KWT's way of working is working closely with the local communities. And so part of our predator program utilizes lion ambassadors. And these are young people who live within the communities in different villages. And they are the first point of call anytime there's a conflict with lions or any other predators. The communities know them and then call them, and they're able to go and assess what's happened, assess why the livestock were attacked by the predator, and then work towards what are the best solutions. Is it better securing your livestock, or is it better grazing practices? So having harder trainings, if there's a lot of loss of livestock or even loss of life, we then call the authorities and help the community fill in the paperwork. And because this model of community engagement has worked really well for us with our predator program, we decided to employ the same framework with the livelihoods program. So we've employed a network of 20 field agents, and these agents come from different parts of the Mara ecosystem as well. And with these agents, we're then able to get in touch with livestock owners in particular areas. So these 20 conservation agents are sort of our representatives. And a lot of them are young people, both men and women, because we're also looking at how do we get the young people, the youth, taking part in agriculture, in conservation, and again, use of technology. They're more willing to learn. And so when Kami came, she met with these agents, and they are the ones who we've sat down with and asked them what are the main needs when it comes to livestock. What are the biggest challenges when it comes to, rearing livestock and getting them to market to get the best price. And so that's how we knew that health of the livestock is a big thing. Access to vets and proper medication, knowing when the disease outbreaks, knowing alerts on weather patterns, and all these things came through consultation with their conservation agents. And so when Kami came and sat with them, they took her to the market, and she was able to see how a real livestock market in the Mara looks like. Then going to talk to them about what do you want this technology to do for you? Because we also don't want to give suggestions that seem like they make sense for us or are easy for us, but don't serve the purpose. So she sat down with them, and they were able to say, actually, we'd like to have a decision tree for diseases. These are some of the diseases that are very common in this area. And so they went through that, and we had a vet also saying, these are the symptoms that you need to be there. And so it was quite collaborative, and the technology really talks to what is needed. And that's something we've learned directly from the communities through the conservation agents.
And James, tell us a little bit about the person who came in to work with Irene's team and went out into the villages. I mean, what sort of training did he or she have? How can you be confident of getting a person into a remote area and expecting him or her to deliver, if I can say, the functional requirements of a software solution that will work for hundreds and thousands of people?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So Cami that we're talking about, her role is product manager. So that is basically the person within the team. It's a common software development role. It's the person who really understands the problem that we're trying to solve, understands the context of that problem. So does some of the research to kind of understand how we can solve that problem, and feeds back to our technical team so that they know exactly what it is they need to build to get that result. And I think this is a really good point, just more broadly to what Irene was talking about, is that, as you say, dropping software into an area like this, there is no silver bullet, and we really need to work collaboratively with people who know the users very well to make sure that our solution is configured in the right way. But this is very common. This is why we are, in terms of software development niche sector, we still follow a lot of the common software development principles that really account for these kind of issues. So it's worth noting that in any kind of region where you apply technology with smallholders, no two smallholders are the same, even across somewhere like Kenya. Different counties have different requirements. Different people within individual counties or individual communities have different requirements. And it's our job as software developers to understand that and make sure that our product accounts for all those changes. And so what we use is two methodologies that, people may or may not have come across. So one is a principle called user-centered design. So user-centered design is all that stuff that we talked about. Cami, as a product manager, she knows what she needs to do to understand the context of those local people. And you, as a good software developer, should be able to, or, part of the software development team, should be able to go into any context with whether they be farmers, whether they're bankers, whether they're construction workers, and really understand that user's needs and understand what job is it they're trying to do and what is the problem that our technology can really solve. That's a skill that can be learned and applied in any application. And then the next thing, the next tool or methodology that we use is called an agile workflow. And so an agile workflow is really breaking everything down into the individual assumptions that we're trying to make, and essentially trying to break that big problem down into smaller components that we can then address individually and reduce the risk of building our software and then it being actually effective for our end users. So what you don't want to do is say, okay, yeah, we know what we need to do. We build it all up front, spend a huge amount of time building a solution, and then go out and find, we've built everything through SMS and literacy is only around 30%. So 70% of the users can't use it. This agile methodology is applied to make sure that doesn't happen. So you reduce all of those risks. And that essentially goes through, and this is kind of where this work with KWT fits in, is you go through, again, a preset number of stages that really breaks this down in a very sensible and logical way. So you first really, all you start with is a process called discovery. And that doesn't involve any software development at all. It's all about really examining the problem. And again, someone like Cami, who is been in software development from a software development background, has a number of research methods in that discovery process that are very standardized, that allow us to really understand, okay, what is the context of these farmers that we're building within? Then the next stage is that you do what's called an alpha stage, which is where you, because you've understood the problem, you understand the constraints you're working within, you understand where the biggest risks are, where the biggest assumptions are. We use that information to actually build a wide range of different potential solutions that could solve that problem. And what you do is it's called rapidly prototyping. So you take those problems and you try and build the kind of minimum viable solution. So the smallest thing you possibly can that allows you to test whether that kind of idea or that concept has legs. And you do lots of different ones. And you go out and again, you go and test those with the users. So that's when Cami went out and we had a prototype for SMS. We had a prototype for IVR. We had multiple different prototypes for how we could get this decision tree for livelihood support to the farmers. And testing that practically with the users allowed us to understand, okay, there are some more nuances here that we need to bear in mind when going to the next stage of building a solution. And through that kind of alpha process, it gives you an idea of which of those solutions is the most viable. And that's the one you take forward to build. And then it's at that point that then it's all being done at quite a small scale in partnership with KWT, their team, like Irene mentioned, the field agents and the champion farmers on the ground, the farmers themselves, the vets, all of those different stakeholders that are really important for us to understand. And then when you go to scale, we have a product that we know will work. And then the question is, okay, how do we get this to more people? So you're not really figuring out You're not taking that silver bullet right from the beginning and saying, how do we get this to thousands of farmers? We now have a solution that we know will almost 100% work. Now, just the question is, how do we get that in front of more people? Obviously, you start with the champion farmers and the field agents, but then you can start looking at, okay, could we use the vets to promote this software to more farmers that aren't connected with KWT, for example? And again, you break all those problems down into different stages, but they're all predetermined in software development. And that's what allows us to build a solution that works very well in such a kind of niche and immature market. So hopefully that is a bit long-winded, but that's kind of a foray into the software development process. And that's how we're able to actually kind of not just airdrop technology in a way that is unusable. We use these techniques to actually create something that is viable and works for the audience that we're trying to deliver to.
So with this process, Irene, where are you now? What's your next steps?
So Kami just visited some weeks ago. And so what we're going to do is then now trial it, and our 20 agents are a good representation for us in terms of feedback, and because they got smartphones, so they'll be able to use it on a smartphone and tell us, does this meet the need? But having said that, not everybody has a smartphone, but most people have the analog phones. So trying it out on SMS as well. So with the agents going out to the different farmers and trying to talk them through it, then we'll be able to get feedback and see what's the reception of this kind of technology from, a 20-year-old livestock owner to a 50-year-old livestock owner, or a 30-year-old woman who has, sheep and goats. So we are still at that first stage of, we've now gotten at least, the decision tree done and gotten feedback. So take it now to the community and trial it out. But in terms of the greater, livelihoods program, as I said before, it was really developed with the community and targeting some of the pain points that, the community have around how do we get the most from our livestock. And one of the things that came up was about livestock husbandry. And so one of the things we are looking to roll out in the next couple of months is a comprehensive vaccination campaign across the Mara. So having a vaccination calendar where people are able to know, when do you vaccinate, for what, and who will do it, and how much will it cost, and just then keeping a record, and then just making sure that livestock are healthy, because before taking them to market, we need to have them healthy. So with the technology, we are still early days, but with the rest of the program, we are sort of making good progress.
So the follow-up question is that, Irene, at this point of time, could you tell us a little bit about the broader impact of your livelihood program? I mean, you've been doing that for a couple of years.
I think one of the really interesting things that has come out of it is a bit more of an appreciation of what we do in the landscape, because we've moved from being those people who just tell us to bear with the losses we get from predators attacking our livestock and being told, okay, this is how to secure them, to, that's the organization that comes and we're able to also ask them that our livestock was lost or has been lost to wildlife. You've helped us secure, the enclosure. You've given our herders training about how to graze in an area with wildlife, but then you've also helped us see how to improve the health of our livestock. And you've been able to guide us in the right way and, tell us these are the vets and these are the dangers of self-prescribing antibiotics to livestock, and also talking about the impact of a grazing and starting to come up with solutions on how do we restore these grazing lands. And so for us, we are looking at the work we do with predators as being really holistic and not just focusing on the wildlife, but being people focused, because that's the only way we can have a positive conservation impact. And when we started the program, because we've just closing out our proof of concept, we started with a target of 1,000 people. And our ambition is to scale it across even more parts of the Mara and reach a wider population.
We've concluded this section of our podcast. And before we go on to understand a little bit about how your organizations came together and what the broader lessons are, let me just touch upon two things which I have learned while talking to both of you. First of all, this integrated approach. I mean, there's one thing to read about the IPCC special report on land degradation and desertification, but the solution to this is the way, Irene, you talked about the integrated approach of building trust within the community, providing them a range of services that would help them conserve their livelihood in changing times. And James, the thing that I have learned from you is, and I must say that I used to run these services part of a large software product development company, and we used to use agile methodology and user-centric design, completely different context. It's just fascinating for me to hear of these same methodologies being used in a context that really matters and extremely complex. So, a huge congratulations to you and your product manager. With that, we would move on to the next section where we just reflect a bit on the lessons. And I want to ask you, I know both your organizations have done a lot of things correctly. The product manager and her role has been very well described. Irene, your team has been able to take her into the community and help her understand. Sometimes things would have gone wrong. Sometimes things could have gone wrong, but didn't at the last moment. Give us an insight into some of that drama.
I think it's definitely taken a bit longer than we initially anticipated. When we started working on the proof of concept, we were hoping it would take 12 months. Obviously, that's taken a while because we really wanted to have a lot of community engagement, and we did a lot of stakeholder mapping and talked to local partners as well. So that took longer than we thought. That's really not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's just that it's a slow process, and we do have to go through the process. I think the technology maybe, and James said this before, the level of technological literacy wasn't as high as we thought it would be. So we had to go back to the drawing board. And I think even before that, in terms of the decision tree, and I'll ask James to jump in here, I think we had what we thought were, the common diseases, and we had to really understand what the symptoms were, because then that goes into part of the decision tree. But then taking it to the vet, and the vet saying, no, this is all wrong. You've got to word it in a certain way so that it's understood, because it needs to make sense in a local context. I think a lot of the back and forth. And then also in terms of the culture, we know that overgrazing and degradation is as a direct result of overstocking. So it's a very difficult conversation to have with the Masai, and saying that one way to stop degradation is by destocking. And that's an integral part of the culture. So it has to be approached very sensitively. So that's something that's ongoing, and, talking about quantity versus quality. So that's not an easy conversation to have, but I think the impacts are very visible. So hopefully there'll be change, but that does take some time. Yeah. So James, maybe you could talk about some of the technological drama we've come across.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to reiterate some of the points that you made, Irene. I think it's always a challenge for us. There's kind of two things. So, KWT isn't our only client. We're a software development company trying to run a business and make revenue. So the biggest challenge for us is that we're very strong, as I said, on this user-centered design and agile workflow. And kind of Irene alluded to that there. That's exactly what we believe in, is that it should be community and stakeholder engagement led. Those are the people, if you don't truly consider those areas where you need to be sensitive, or where things could be a point where everything falls down on, if you don't consider that, you can end up building a solution and then no one uses it because you've missed something really important. So taking that time to do that kind of engagement and that UCD is so important, but balancing that with all the other client demands and running the business is often where these delays or issues come in, because what you find is when you're trying to collaborate with lots of different people, we might have time at one point where we're ready to go and do the research and build some of the prototypes, but KWT might have priority somewhere else. And it's juggling all of these different priorities that is always the challenge. But I think that's a challenge for everyone, all the time. I think we've got a lot of different stakeholders, and when we have multiple different clients, trying to balance all those things at once is always going to be, difficult. But I think what we try and always do is make sure we have open communication with people like Irene and her team to make sure that we're at least on the same page with why that's happening. I think that's probably the main thing. I mean, I wouldn't say the things like technology literacy or literacy hiccups per se, because I think that's the whole point of doing the contextual research, is to figure those things out. Like, we consider them, we have assumptions basically about what the solution might look like. And the whole point of our approach, and it is quite scientific in the approach, is to take those assumptions and then create hypotheses around that and say, okay, we believe that enough people will be literate that an SMS-based solution will work. And then you go to disprove that hypothesis. And that's what we did. And then said, okay, well, this has to change things. But I wouldn't consider that a problem, because that's kind of always part of good software development. But I think it's the logistics and the timings and the collaborations that always what cause delays and things to happen. But that's part of working in this way. And so you kind of have to roll with those punches and go with it. We over time worked out how we can work effectively together and get to a result. So that's probably from, my experience.
And now I was going to add, one other challenge has always been funding around this. So, that was also because of the delay, trying to get, the funds to be able to run the POC and convincing donors that this is something worth investing in. That is an ongoing challenge. So just trying to make sure we have enough funds to realize what our initial objectives were.
I'm actually glad that you brought that up, because that's, to me, would have been my next question. I mean, there must be lessons here. James's company is trying to make a revenue and funded by perhaps private sector investors, right? And you are funded by donors, as you said. To me, that the fact that you two organizations have come together to create real impact, there must be lessons for these two types of investors to come together. And I would like to hear some reflections on that.
Yeah, I think I can take that initially. As Irene said, and I'd like to kind of reiterate that from the private sector aspect, the financing is, I think, always a big challenge in this sector. It's emerging markets. They're very immature markets. People don't know very much about them. A lot of people, especially in Europe and the US, don't, on the whole, really know anything about Africa, even though it's such a vast opportunity, such an area for potential growth. People really don't understand it very well. And that's an issue that we've had. We formed, this financing question is fundamental to why we came to be Climate Edge and how we've made decisions. When we started, one of the big things that we wanted to do was that we wanted to get out of those donor funding cycles, because we wanted to avoid those issues that Irene's brought up. Now, there are pros and cons to both approaches. So what we wanted to avoid is that we wanted to have a product that could be sustainably developed and applied despite what the priorities of donors were, because we know that we've seen it. We've been working in this field for 10 years, and we've seen donors go from really heavily funding climate smart adaptation to then really focusing on, for example, gender and inclusivity, to now climate's coming back in the picture. Food security is another thing. And with that, the kind of focus of your projects and what you're actually working on often changes. And we wanted to avoid being kind of caught in those kind of gusts. But then that means we have to deal with private investors. And even if you're working with impact investors, still fundamental business economics are always king. So revenue growth and number of users reached and engagement, traditional kind of things you measure, metrics you measure software with. And that's difficult because, again, we're working in a market that's, an emerging market. There's a lot of potential, but we're having to figure out a lot of things at all times. And many investors aren't willing to take that risk. So that's why it's very beneficial to come to people and have partnerships with people like KWT who work within those donor streams, but to be able to come as kind of a separate entity where we don't have to be so influenced by that kind of funding focus, but can kind of access some of that funding through people like KWT to be able to do our work. But it's very difficult because, the private funding and the donor funding are so very different, but neither of them are perfect. And that's kind of an issue that we as a company are trying to kind of navigate. And I'm sure it's the same with Irene and kind of issues that they have with presumably donor funding and kind of the loops that you have to jump through there to be able to get that. And yeah, it's kind of a big challenge. And I think collaborations and partnerships are where you can kind of try and get the best of both worlds. But it's definitely one of the biggest kind of barriers to succeeding in this market is trying to get sustainable funding that works for our types of organizations.
Exactly. And one thing that you mentioned is people from the Western world do not really appreciate Africa. What about people who travel there? Irene talked about Masai Mara, the crowning jewel in Kenya's tourism landscape. Is it possible for the individuals to get involved?
Yes, we have lots of investor conversations because we're actually in a fundraising cycle at the moment. And one of the clearest indicators that someone might, will be willing, particularly the angel funders, so individual high net worth individuals who might invest individually. Yeah, one of the clearest indicators whether they will be interested is whether they've ever been to somewhere like Kenya or Tanzania, because they instantly have a much better understanding and an interest in that part of the world. And then you can just skip from, otherwise with investors that haven't ever been to Africa, the conversation always starts with almost even just explaining to people that no, there is economic opportunity there. Yes, people, even in agriculture, they're running businesses. There are agrochemical companies that make hundreds of millions of dollars from this market. People don't understand even those basic facts. Whereas someone who's then been and seen, for example, Kenya, already have that understanding and that much kind of more advanced way of thinking about what the market even looks like. And it just means that those conversations are a lot more fruitful and a lot more meaningful. And so we find that angel investors or investors at all, so even VCs who have been to Africa, the conversation is a lot more fruitful. And I think it's for that reason. But it's a very small portion of investors, especially in Europe and the US, who have that experience. You'd be kind of surprised. And I know that places like Kenya have really big tourism industries, but most people that we speak to in the UK, for example, have never been to any African country. So it's not necessarily common that people would have had experience in that market. And that's something that we're still kind of challenging with.
Irene, what about sustainable tourism, local tourism companies? I know you have tried to talk to a few of them. Is it possible to, shall I say, crowdfund money into these projects?
So Sanjay, I'm usually asked what keeps me awake up at night, and it's funding and getting money to run the organization, to run the program. And KWT initially was set up on individual funding and high net worth individuals. So people who've come to Africa and to Kenya and have an appreciation of nature would then fund. That is great funding, but then it's not sustainable because someone can only give for so long before we have to start looking at other ways of raising funds. So in terms of tourism companies, yes, we've got partnerships with some of them, but a lot of the support they give us depends on the number of tourists they get. So during COVID, when they had no tourists, we received no funding from the tourism companies. During years when tourism is low, then obviously the donations we get from them gets low. And being in Africa, all that needs to happen is an Ebola outbreak somewhere. And then, there's a travel advisory or a terrorist attack or elections in the case of Kenya. So funding from tourism companies is not consistent. And so we've got to spend a lot of time looking for funding elsewhere, looking at foundations, trying to build relationships with corporates. And that's something KWT has over the last couple of years spent some time doing. But then a challenge is the unrestricted funding. So we get funding for very specific things. And I think that's one of the key challenges with donor funding. It's usually very specific, do this activity, but there's no funding to pay the person who's doing that activity. So it's always a back and forth. As James has said, do we let donors drive the organization's agenda, or should they come in and say, we're going to support these strategic objectives that you've laid? So it's still quite a challenge getting sustainable funding, and not just for KWT, but I think for conservation as a whole. And, we need to have conversations around how do we finance conservation for sustainability rather than for short term, rather than for whatever is flavor of the month at that time. I think that's an ongoing challenge. And until somebody can come up with that really perfect answer on how we can get sustainable financing for projects like ours, then we'll still have to spend a lot of time. And a lot of my time is actually spent fundraising, writing proposals, trying to convince foundations, organizations, institutions that the work we do is really important. But we do have supporters who come in every so often.
I think, sorry, just to jump in there, I think that's a really good point about the getting funding for specific activities. And one of the things that we noticed very early on, we work with a lot of NGOs just due to the nature of kind of this sector. And often we'd work with NGOs that work with, because we do a lot of arable work as well. I mean, as I said, we work a lot in coffee and tea, and they're very kind of high profile industries. They have big cooperatives that often get a lot of kind of interest with a lot of NGOs, and a lot of projects go through them. And there was a few times where we would go to visit farmers, and the farmers, were not interested in what we were doing at all, because so many projects had come through where they had done, like, some people were doing soil testing, or some people were doing, I don't know, biodigesters or sanitation. And the farmers are like, the project comes around for 1 or 2 years and they never see them again, and nothing ever happens. And it's funny that, you think about it from their perspective, and you're like, we're trying to really promote better livelihoods. We're trying to help you out here. Why aren't you more engaged? But when you look at it from their perspective, they're thinking, well, because nothing ever sticks. And I think that's part of that kind of, again, why we really didn't want to get fallen into that donor trap. That can often be what happens, that it's almost the opposite. What I was talking about with software development is an agile process. Donor funding in many ways is waterfall, which is the opposite, where everything has to be predetermined up front. Like Irene was saying, what you're delivering and all the activities are decided a year before you get the funding. And then you have to work through those deliverables and work packages exactly how you said it, and spend money exactly how you allocated it at the beginning, which means there's no flex for change or learning or any differences that come out from actually doing those activities. And then that means that often these projects fail and nothing happens. You don't get any more follow-up funding, and the project's not sustainable. And I think that is a real big problem in this sector, and it's something that needs to be addressed to try and create some sustainability, like Irene was saying, so that you can actually just get on with your core objectives that you've set out, because you know what you're doing, you know what's really important in the sector, and not having to be swayed by some external party that has a different agenda. I think that's a real big issue that needs to be addressed in some ways.
I think this discussion has nailed it, actually. The world is fast moving, all the time changing. And in fact, in the world of climate change, we just don't know where we are starting, and we don't know where the path that we should take. At the same time, donors, whether it's foundations or multilateral climate funds, want a theory of change for 5 years, as if the whole path can be laid out to the last detail. And I think that is, to me, the fundamental reason why it is impossible to move money into this field, because there's this preconceived notion that we know what to achieve. We know that we have to, almost the assumption that we have to move big capital. The idea of taking it in small test steps, spending some money to learn and iterate further, is just completely absent from the donating community. That's something that private sector companies understand very clearly. With that, we've come to the end of the podcast. It's been a fascinating discussion. So I'm going to ask you, do you have any questions for me?
I guess for myself, do you have kind of a vision? Because I know that you work a lot in climate financing, and we've kind of touched upon, financing as being one of the big kind of barriers or issues to getting some more substantial traction in this sector. Do you have a vision for what you think a solution of sustainable climate financing actually looks like? Is that something that you have considered?
My vision is that we run a program which allows organizations to get funding for partnerships. So in this particular case, Kenya Wildlife Trust says that, we want to build climate resilience among the Masai tribe in this area. And you come together and you say, okay, we want to pilot this technology over a period of 2 years. And broadly, we know that this goal should be achieved, but we will find out exact things that we do in a 2-year, 3-year time frame. And then on the basis of it, what I would hope is that foundations can commit donor money on the back of impact investor investment in your companies so that commercial models can be built. That to me is kind of the vision that I have.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I know that there are a few donors or organizations that are starting to think in that way and trying to create. Mercy Corps AgriFin comes to mind. I know I've had conversations with them. They're trying to create almost collaborative ecosystems that can facilitate those kind of partnerships. So you're funding the ecosystem that is sustainable, not one individual, partner, for example, but you can help bring in people where they're required. That helps everyone, just reduce the barriers for everyone to actually get the outcomes that they're trying to get to, which I thought was quite an interesting concept that I think it sounds like you're alluding to as well, which I think makes a lot of sense.
And my last question is, if our listeners want to get in touch with your two organizations, how should they?
So for Climate Edge, you can find us at our website. So if you just Google Climate Edge, climate and then Edge, EDGE, you'll find our website, which is climateedge.com. Find me on LinkedIn. So I'm James Alden, Alden. You can find us there.
Irene?
Yes, so you can find us online. We've got Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, but our website is kenyawildlifetrust.org. So Kenya Wildlife Trust is all one word. And I'm also on LinkedIn and really looking to form more partnerships because we found that that's a really good way of getting new ideas. So definitely partnerships with organizations like James's and having private sector involved in the conservation sector as well. Really, I think it builds up good story to what we're trying to do to demonstrate conservation impact.
With that, thank you very much, Irene and James.
Thank you, Sanjoy.
Thank you, Sanjoy.
If you like this podcast, do visit us on regainparadise.org, regainparadise.com. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and you can also subscribe to these podcasts on Anchor, Spotify, Google, Apple, and YouTube.